Needs me. In 1 second here. Da 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 da. What's my good chair? Welcome, welcome, everybody. I am such a silly girl, I'm telling you. I made myself a cup of coffee and I've just spilt it all over my desk here, as per. I just destroyed another keyboard with another coffee that I had spilt earlier in the week, and I have been using the on-screen keyboard and it seems to be working just fine for me. I don't even know why I need a keyboard on my PC. But yeah, spilling this coffee, I don't know what it is. If it's just not paying attention or if I shouldn't even be having a cup of coffee at the desk because I am so careless sometimes. Jeez. And I'm only saying that because I actually spilt my coffee twice. I was in the process of wiping the coffee that I had spilt over my phone. And it was like pulled up like a little bowl of cereal with all the coffee sitting on the screen. I was like, how did I do that? And I'm cleaning that up and I got that cleaned up and I just double checked to make sure my phone still worked being underneath that kind of liquid. But I do have the Pixel. It's a great phone. I go swimming. I'm taking it in the ocean with me and stuff. But yeah, it's a phone that I don't worry too much about the water. And I always make sure that I have good cases on my phone and always a good screen protector on them because again, carelessness and not really taking into the consideration the value of things, right? You know, for a lot of people, just having a phone would be such a luxury. It would be like beyond anything they could ever hope to have for themselves because they're so hard up to even keep groceries in the cupboard and milk on the cereal or clothes on their kids. I get it. I grew up in a household like that. And, it truly was not fun. And because we're talking about guilt and shame this week, it was something that I found shameful. It was really hard to not be noticed in class of society that my family was in. My dad thought he was a big shot, and I think in some ways he really was a big shot. At the very least, he was the king of his own castle, his home, his family. But everybody loved my father. And, one of those personas that does get attached, and he kind of thrived on it, was that Rat Pack kind of lifestyle, and he really did think he was something special, and people treated him that way. He treated himself that way, and it just became something of his nature. Okay, I don't know where I'm going with that, but we are talking about guilt and shame, and in having these topics to tear apart and put back together, I do have to go back there and check it out. I have to go back there and I have to sit with some of those experiences, those conversations, those heartbreaks. And, right, let's not forget, in mixing the turnips with the mashed potatoes, those good times, those amazing aspects of my experience so far that has, right, contributed to me even being able to show up here at midnight. Hello, Eugene. How are you doing tonight, dear? Oh my goodness, you're up late too. I really have been settling into this routine of doing my my live show just before I go to bed, it makes for a really good sleep because I have that real sense of accomplishment right at the end of my day. And with a sense of accomplishment, there's an aspect of that uh, that makes it so that your whole system, right, just not your body, not just your mind, but your entire system come to a relaxation. And it's that job well done. That's that that. And when I do my live shows at the end of my day, for lots of people, it's the beginning of their day, depending where you live in the world, right? But for me, to exhaust that last bit, and it's not a last bit. I have resources. I have stuff that I just keep off to the side in an emergency. Right? Knowing, right? Eventually it's going to cross my path. And, to be able to just jump in and take care of whatever I need to take care of without having an anxiety attack, right? And I do have them. Oh my goodness. You send me off for a job interview. Oh my goodness. I hate job interviews. Nothing would trigger me more into having a bit of a panic attack than having to go in for a job interview. It's because you don't know who the person is you're meeting, right? Who's behind that door? Who's sitting behind that desk? And for myself, I can settle into it really fast. I shine in interviews. And for the most part, it's not very often I don't get the job, truly, when I go for the interview. But it's the point of doing it because, again, I don't know what's going on behind that door. I understand that the person that's sitting behind that desk has made their decision within 30 seconds of laying their eyes on you. And that's a truth. That's an unfortunate truth, but that's business, right? And those fast decisions could save lots and lots of money. You could probably get in a few extra job interviews in during the course of the day in making that decision quickly and ending that interview quickly, right? And that perfect person, that perfect employee would be that last person because you were able to squeeze them in. You guys, we are talking about guilt and shame this week. I went kind of down a little side branch there, but what I wanted to do was talk about guilt and shame a little bit more because we are in that season where we should be making moves. Even myself, and right, I'm going, where do I go? What do I do? Right? And I'm chasing my tail and I'm leaving myself open. I'm giving myself contemplation time. I'm connecting with Mother Nature. I am grinding. I am taking in the lessons. I'm having those conversations. I'm making those connections and, right, making sure that the ones in my vicinity are all taken care of, being my nature in that little bit of mother henning, right? But back to the main branch of the tree and talking about guilt and shame, I wanted to lessen, and when I say not a lesson, but lessen, like take away a little bit of that heaviness, maybe a little bit of that anxiety that we lots of times, quite often, uh, just hold on to, that we're just always on the brink of it, and it never takes much to trigger us into going into it. The whole idea is to lessen and to get us away from the edge at the very least, get us away from that edge so that we don't feel that desperation, that we can maybe stand off a little bit of that anxiety. And, and sticking with the guilt and the shame. If you hung out with me yesterday, you knew it was a little bit of that steering wheel in my life, you know, uh, having that projected onto me, having that steer me in directions that maybe some people thought were good for me, but maybe steer me in directions opposite than where I really should have been going. And also keep me on that edge, that very edge, right? By making me feel that guilt and shame, making me feel like I wasn't working hard enough, that I wasn't smart enough, that I wasn't pretty enough. And, like these things impact our moods, right? And being in that negative state, we don't do ourselves justice and we don't do anybody else any good at the same token, because that negative state will not allow us to make any movement at all, won't allow us to make good decisions and put a little bit of action in those decisions, because we'll just freeze in that. We'll just procrastinate in it. We'll just dig our heels in that. And that's what it was meant to do to us. One of those ingredients in my life, and I don't know if this is reflective or mirrored in anybody else's life, but if you're highly sensitive, if you're a little bit hyper vigilant, if you've had an interesting experience so far in your existence. A lot of mix, good and difficult and bad and heartbreaking, and a little bit of a boot in the butt and a little bit of a disappointment. And right, meaning it hasn't always been easy, right? And we are very sensitive to that. And, in our own immediate family, right, people notice that. People get that. People will steer that in the guilt and shame. And how it worked with me was in that really feeling bad about myself. And not just feeling bad about myself, but being on that edge constantly, and being on that edge in a way that I always felt like I was in trouble, right? I never knew when the shoe was going to drop, right? Um, where personalities would just have enough and snap, and being that hypervigilance into looking for it, waiting for it, right? And then avoiding it, and then probably knowing my nature, just trying to keep others out of the line of fire in that. And it was always directed to me, right? Because always in trouble. If you're in trouble, well, what are you feeling guilty for, right? What are you ashamed of? What do you need to fess up? And this was one of those states that I was consistently left in, to simmer in. And I after a while I didn't need anybody to use that steering wheel and make me feel guilty and make me feel shame. I did it to myself. And it's only in this experience that I'm having that I'm finally getting to get that picture, and to recognize some things that I did maybe mindlessly. Is that the word that I'm looking for? Unintentionally. But these unintentional things that I did served me and worked for me. And one of those things was to be honest in these problems that I had in my hypervigilance, right? A lot of bosses in my past, and we're getting there. A lot of bosses in my past didn't get a fair shake with me, or should I say, I didn't give them a fair shake because in my hypervigilance, quite often, and in that understanding that I was about to get in trouble at any second, I was going to get in trouble, and I would stumble over myself to do extra good jobs, to do other people's jobs, to save the day. And it was all directed in that guilt and shame that I carried. But it's only in these recent years that I've come to understand that a lot of it was directed. A lot of it was with the intent that I should feel that way. And I was able to put up some boundaries in that. And being able to put up some boundaries, it was kind of giving other people an opportunity to take note before they said something that, right, in cause and effect, they said something that possibly it might not necessarily because I'm learning along the way. I'm picking up those tools and applying them to my tool belt, and I practice them in my craft too. That's what's the whole point of learning these things if you don't see if you can actually put them to use. But I have to say there was one thing that I did, and it was in telling my managers, my bosses, or the owners of whatever business I was working in the moment, these hypervigilant tendencies that I had. Maybe I would be a little bit honester and just tell a little bit about my upbringing, some of those difficulties that might trigger uh, a reaction that wouldn't necessarily be pertinent to the moment, but because I feel it, because I'm so hyper vigilant, I might take it that way and react in that. I would be honest in a lot of aspects, a lot of those idiosyncrasies about me that people might pounce on, right? Or might think badly of me that it was like intent, when in actuality it was just carelessness and me paying attention in what I was doing. That I would be honest in that, and I would express these difficulties that I would have. I would fess them up. And there were a time I would never have done anything that like that. I would never let people understand my weaknesses. I wouldn't let them even know that I was weak in any manner because, right, I didn't want to be taken advantage of. I didn't want that feedback. I didn't want anybody knowing what my Achilles heel was, right? Heels, as in plural. Make that clear. But one thing I knew, that when I started doing that, when people used what they knew because I expressed it to them, and they used it in their workings with me, when they used it in steering my ship or even their ship, knowing that I was going to move with that, I'd had too many lessons around my belt that there was no way that I was going to allow that to happen. And not only was I not going to allow that to happen, I have to give a little bit of a grateful out there, right? Because there was a time that I wouldn't have even recognized that that was happening, right? Because I would never express it, but being the person I am, it's quite readable, right? People tell me all the time how naive I am, but I am naive in what I choose to be naive in, and at the same time, maybe I'm not so naive. If I could figure out a little system like that, what else could I figure out to make that cush in between those difficult moments in my life in whatever aspect, physical, mental, emotional, right? So, in getting in trouble and how to bring it into this guilt and shame topic, and in what I do with my brand, right? Because we have to stay on brand, it is the idea that we have these aspects at ourselves that we think are truly, truly negative. And if we stay in that negative, we'll never be able to have those good things happen in our life, you know. I gobbled up that guilt and shame like it was popcorn, and it was really hard for me to come out of that state. And even in some of these difficult circumstances that I get in my life as of recently, right? It feels different, right? Still makes me a little bit nervous, but it's not got me on the edge. And that's the truth. It's manageable. And when it's manageable, this is manageable, right? And that going off the edge, right? Going into that panic mode, it's less likely to happen, right? Or at the very least, be as detrimental in its expression. Guilt and shame is something that will truly bring you down because in my life and in my experience, I got to have that completely lifted off of me. If you guys have been hanging out with me for any length of time, you know there was a point where I was 311 pounds. That was my highest, 311 pounds. And, you know, through the graces of people who cared and wanted to offer up a kindness that I graciously accepted, um, I had an opportunity to lose that weight, and I did. And my entire spirit completely did a I'm going to say 180, the opposite of where I was at. In that sadness and that miserableness, and even though I was having fun, right? Right? It was still negative because I brightened up enough to create a magnificent life for myself. It didn't last, right? Remember, I was a compulsive gambler at the time. So eventually I got dragged under again, but I was up long enough to take a breath and to take a look at my life and what I had accomplished. And I knew directly, right, that yes, it's what's in this inside that counts. Because I was in that experience, right? That I had changed so drastically inside, specifically because I had changed the outside in my life. And I really felt bad. I really felt bad in that because I lived on that as a kid, right? My dad and my grandmother, right? Tell me it's what's in the inside that counts, Cindy. It's what's in the inside. But no, what's on the outside, I had a good taste, you know, in that experience where I was able to bloom and come alive. Like I said, it didn't last forever, but it lasted long enough for me to recognize what I needed to do in order, right? And that was a little bit of taking care of myself, right? I took care of myself physically. I didn't take care of myself mentally. Emotionally, I felt better, right? Because I was getting into beautiful clothes. I had men staring at me and chasing me, right? I had a great job. had lots of money. Life just kind of snowballed down and picked up, and it just turned into something magnificent. But again, being that person that was immersed in those coping mechanisms, and for me, it was gambling at the time, I allowed myself to be dragged back under. But I was up enough to recognize what it could be. And it could have been forever. It wasn't in my choices at that time. In fact, I wasn't even woke to any of these ideas. It was just a happy accident that that experience happened so that, well, so that I could experience that. Guilt and shame, it's really crappy. You have to get it off the plate. And, however you talk to yourself in that negative way, that's the indicator of where that problem is, right? For women, lots of times it's that inner tube around their waist, and that guilt and shame suffers because they've gained 20 pounds over winter and they beat themselves up. All of us girls in my family, we do that to ourselves, right? Our weights are always up and up and down that way. So I get it because I stayed in that negative state for decades in all honesty, right? It's only in that taking off the table sometimes that we can actually bring to the table. And we have to start with ourselves and take a look at our lives and say, what's making our lives so heavy? What's dragging us down, especially right now when we should be moving and flowing good, and right, things should be just coming to us nice and easy without the hiccups and the failures and stuff, right? Well, that's the state. That's the state that we're in. And that just means that, right, we just need a few more lessons along the belt. But that's, right, in helping people like me, because I was never meant to work like underneath, right? I could partner, I could work for myself, I could even work for free in volunteering, right? And giving up my own time. But being under the directive of somebody who is going to use what I openly discussed, right? Set those boundaries, and then just have that with just pure inconsideration, just trampled over and ignored, right? This is what highly sensitives and empaths, INFJs, there's so many different labels for yourself. It's just somebody that's just so sensitive that it just sometimes easier to go along with others than to go along with yourself. And that's the truth. And I'm making it light there so it's easy digestible because we're just sitting here having a cup of coffee together. But sometimes it's just jogging a thought, right? Or having somebody just recognize something in their own experience through the story of my own experience, that maybe we can make a little bit of movement for ourselves. That happened for me, right? So it would be amazing in that little bit of payback that, right, that somebody else might get triggered in a good way, right? Because we haven't gotten to the point yet where I know where your boundaries are or where your triggers are. I'm only going to make the assumption that if you're hanging out with me, right, then maybe some of those things that bug you might be the same things that bug me, right? And those same things that motivate me, inspire me, right? To just keep trying and keep experimenting and right and keep recognizing and paying attention to what works and what doesn't work and be able to take whatever you can off the table so that you can bring a little bit of your own to the table. Okay. I'm fizzling out now, you guys. I'll come back into my life, I think, tomorrow, watch it for myself. Um, I I did make a note here about, that feeling that I always had when I grew up, even in my adulthood, even in this job that I quit. I always, and it's the worst feeling ever, to not even have any reason to feel that way, but to be on that edge and always feel like you were just on the edge of being yelled at or fired or have your work demeaned. And what you think about is realized, right? But in also understanding that you got boundaries and you have right to hold those boundaries out, right? Especially they're just reasonable, common courtesies that you should give to any employee, but it doesn't always happen that way. So sometimes we have to be our own bosses, right? Okay. Eugene, you have a great night. Thank you so much. See you tomorrow, Eugene. Um, Everybody, for those of you who are going to come home from work and pop your legs up, I hope you're having an amazing night. I hope you have a good sleepy. For those of you who are just getting up and you're just going to work, right? Well, maybe in this you could find something and just do a little experiment for yourself in your own surroundings. Because, for most of us, we do work for the man, don't we? Right? But it would be really, really nice that for some of us who really need to be our own bosses, that we might have that opportunity to be our own bosses. And it is, right? We just keep moving forward, just trusting in the lessons. Okay, you guys, have a great night. See you tomorrow.